Nobody noticed the old white truck parked outside the servo at 4:12 in the morning. The engine rattled softly in the freezing Victorian air while exhausted tradies wandered inside for coffee and meat pies before sunrise. To everyone around him, the bloke sitting behind the wheel looked completely ordinary. Grey hoodie, rough hands, cheap boots covered in dust. Just another Australian driver trying to survive another brutal workday. But what nobody knew was that hidden behind that quiet life sat an investment portfolio worth more than $12 million. And the craziest part? He never won the lottery, never built a tech company, never inherited a cent. While most Australians were drowning in debt trying to look successful, this man was quietly buying shares every single month for over 2 decades. No flashy lifestyle, no luxury cars, no fake online guru nonsense, just discipline, silence, and one terrifying lesson Scott Pape later revealed could completely change the future of ordinary middle-class Australians forever. Years later, when Scott finally sat across from the driver during a private interview, the man said something that left the room dead silent. Something so brutally honest that even Scott struggled to answer for a few seconds. Because hidden inside that sentence was the exact reason some people quietly become wealthy, while others stay trapped financially their entire lives without even realizing why. And once you hear what the driver said that night, you'll never look at money the same way again. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, comment your city down below and tell me honestly, if someone handed you an extra $1,000 tomorrow, would you invest it or spend it? And if you enjoy stories about money, investing, and financial freedom, hit subscribe and drop a like. Let's get into it. Scott Pape had spent years traveling across Australia listening to financial stories from ordinary people. Real stories. Not polished TV interviews. Not fake millionaire influencers standing beside rented Lamborghinis. He wanted to understand how average Aussies actually lived. And what he discovered shocked him. The people earning the most money weren't always building wealth. In fact, many were completely broke underneath the surface. Huge mortgages, car loans, credit card debt, designer lifestyles financed by stress. Scott saw teachers earning solid incomes but drowning financially. Couples on 6-figure salaries fighting every month over bills. Families trapped inside giant homes they barely afforded. And quietly, hidden beneath all that pressure, he noticed another group entirely. The silent investors. The ones nobody bragged about online. The ones driving older cars while quietly accumulating assets. The ones collecting dividends while everyone else collected debt. And that's when Scott started hearing whispers about a driver from regional Victoria who had built a fortune so large even local bankers struggled to believe it. At first, Scott thought the story sounded exaggerated. $12 million from shares? Impossible. Not for a bloke driving trucks across rural Australia. But then more stories appeared. A bank manager mentioned him privately. A financial advisor brought him up again months later. Then an accountant finally confirmed it. The rumors were real. Somewhere in Australia, an ordinary driver had quietly built an investment empire larger than most CEOs ever achieve. And nobody saw it coming. Scott became obsessed with understanding how. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This story exposed something much deeper about modern Australian life. The driver grew up poor. Proper poor. The kind of poor where winter mornings felt colder because the heater barely worked. Where takeaway food felt like a luxury. Where parents whispered about overdue bills late at night thinking the kids couldn't hear. His dad worked himself into exhaustion. His mum stretched every dollar like magic. And growing up in that environment changed him permanently. He noticed something early. The hardest working people weren't necessarily becoming financially free. Most were just surviving. And that terrified him. As a teenager, he watched adults destroy themselves trying to look successful. Bigger houses. Newer cars. Endless upgrades. But behind closed doors? Stress. Anxiety. Debt collectors. Arguments. He promised himself he would never live that way. Still, life wasn't easy. He left school early and started driving trucks because there weren't many options. Long highways. Sleepless nights. Diesel fumes. Cold coffee at roadside servos. Endless kilometers under black Australian skies. The job paid enough to survive. Barely. Most drivers around him spent their paychecks immediately. New utes. Weekend drinking sessions. Gambling. Toys financed on credit. But the driver did something strange. Every payday, before touching a single dollar, he bought shares. Not huge amounts. Sometimes just $50, sometimes 100, sometimes less. But every single month, he invested first. And that tiny habit would eventually change everything. At the time, nobody understood why he cared so much about shares. Even his mates laughed at him. "You can't get rich buying boring bank stocks, mate." But he ignored them. Because years earlier, during a random night shift, he'd stumbled across an interview featuring Scott Pape talking about dividend investing. And one sentence changed his entire life. Wealth isn't built through excitement. It's built through consistency. That line stayed stuck in his head while driving endless roads across Australia. Consistency. Not luck. Not timing. Not hype. Just relentless discipline. So while everyone else chased fast money, he quietly bought shares in strong Australian companies, banks, mining giants, supermarket chains, dividend-paying businesses, month after month, year after year. And at first, nothing happened. That's the brutal part nobody talks about. For years, his portfolio looked tiny. While mates upgraded houses and showed off new boats, he drove the same old truck and rented a modest unit. Sometimes even he doubted himself, especially during market crashes. And then came the collapse that nearly broke him emotionally. The Australian stock market plunged hard. News channels screamed panic every night. People sold shares in terror. Co-workers mocked him endlessly, told YA shares were a scam. His portfolio dropped massively. Years of savings wiped out on paper. And one freezing night, sitting alone in his truck with rain smashing against the windshield, he seriously considered selling everything. The fear felt physical. His chest tightened, hands shaking slightly. The smell of stale coffee filling the cabin while red numbers flashed across finance apps. Then something happened. He remembered another line from Scott Pape. The market transfers wealth from impatient people to patient people. That sentence stopped him. He stared through the rain-covered glass for nearly 20 minutes in silence. Then instead of selling, he bought more. That decision changed his future forever. Because while terrified investors dumped quality shares for cheap prices, he quietly accumulated more assets than ever before. And years later, those same shares exploded in value. Dividend payments grew larger, then larger again. Eventually, something incredible happened. His investments started generating more income than his driving job. At first he thought it had to be wrong. He checked the numbers repeatedly. But it was real. While driving trucks across Australia, this ordinary bloke had quietly built a machine printing money in the background. And nobody around him even noticed. That's the part Scott Pape found most fascinating. The driver never looked wealthy. No designer watches. No flashy social media posts. No luxury obsession. In fact, most people assumed he was struggling financially because of how simple his life looked. But secretly, he had more financial freedom than nearly everyone around him. And that exposed one of the biggest lies modern society tells people. Real wealth often looks boring. Scott later explained this idea during one of his talks, and the room went silent. Because Australians had been trained to associate wealth with appearances. Big houses, expensive cars, luxury lifestyles. But many people showing off expensive lives were financially fragile underneath. Meanwhile, truly wealthy people often looked completely ordinary. That truth made people uncomfortable. Because deep down, they knew it was true. The driver kept investing quietly while the years rolled on. He ignored market noise, ignored trends, ignored social pressure. And every time dividends arrived in his account, he reinvested them. Again, and again, and again. The power of compounding slowly became unstoppable. $100 turned into thousands. Thousands turned into hundreds of thousands. Then millions. And still, he kept driving. Scott eventually asked him why. Why continue working after building such enormous wealth? The driver smiled quietly before answering. Because I wanted freedom, not attention. That sentence hit Scott hard. Because it perfectly explained why the man succeeded. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't chasing status. He was chasing peace. And that changes everything. Most people spend their lives buying symbols of wealth. This bloke bought assets. That's the difference. And honestly, it's a difference most people never fully understand until it's too late. Scott became deeply emotional after hearing the full story because it mirrored something he'd been warning Australians about for years. The middle class wasn't being destroyed by lack of intelligence. It was being destroyed by lifestyle inflation. Every pay rise became an excuse to spend more. Bigger mortgage, bigger car payment, bigger financial pressure. People earning more money while becoming less financially free. Meanwhile, this quiet driver did the opposite. Every extra dollar became an investment. Every dividend became fuel. Every market crash became opportunity. And eventually, the results became impossible to ignore. $12 million. Built slowly, silently, patiently. No shortcuts. No hype. Just decades of disciplined investing. But there's another layer to this story most people miss. The emotional side. Because becoming wealthy this way required something extremely difficult. Isolation. The driver spent years feeling out of place. Friends mocked his frugal lifestyle. Family members questioned his decisions. People assumed he lacked ambition because he avoided flashy spending. But secretly, he understood something they didn't. Temporary validation is expensive. Freedom is priceless. And Scott Pape saw that pattern repeatedly across Australia. The people most desperate to look successful were often the most financially trapped. Meanwhile, the truly wealthy often moved quietly. That lesson completely changed how Scott spoke about money publicly. He stopped focusing purely on numbers. Instead, he focused on behavior, psychology, habits. Because financial success isn't just maths. It's emotional control. And that's where most people collapse. The driver understood this instinctively. When everyone panicked, he stayed calm. When everyone spent recklessly, he invested. When everyone chased appearances, he built ownership. That mindset separated him from almost everyone around him. Scott later admitted the story haunted him for weeks, because it proved ordinary Australians still had a chance, even without massive salaries, even without perfect timing, even without financial privilege. But only if they avoided the trap modern society pushes constantly. Consume now. Show off now. Finance everything. Worry later. The driver rejected all of it. And over time, that decision created extraordinary results. One night, Scott asked him something deeply personal. What was the hardest part? The driver didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his coffee quietly for a few seconds before speaking. Watching people think I was failing, while knowing I was actually winning. That line stayed with Scott forever, because it revealed the hidden emotional cost of long-term investing. Sometimes building wealth means looking unsuccessful for years, driving older cars, living below your means, ignoring pressure to upgrade constantly. And most people psychologically can't handle that. They'd rather look rich immediately than become wealthy slowly. That's why so few people ever achieve true financial freedom. The system feeds on impatience, but the market rewards patience. And this driver became living proof. As his wealth grew, something strange happened. His stress disappeared. Not completely, but dramatically. Because once your investments cover your living costs, fear changes. Work becomes optional. Decisions become calmer. Life becomes lighter. That's what Scott believed financial freedom was truly about. Not yachts. Not mansions. Not luxury. Control. The ability to breathe without constant financial panic. And hearing the driver describe that feeling changed Scott emotionally. Because growing up, he'd seen what financial stress did to people. It aged them, destroyed relationships, killed confidence. But here sat a completely ordinary bloke who escaped that trap through discipline alone. No magic. No genius-level IQ. Just consistency. That idea became one of the most powerful lessons Scott ever shared publicly. And surprisingly, many people hated hearing it, because it exposed uncomfortable truths. Most financial problems aren't caused by lack of income. They're caused by behavior, impulse spending, lifestyle pressure, emotional decision-making. And deep down, many people knew it. That's why Scott's message spread so rapidly across Australia. Because exhausted middle-class families recognized themselves in those stories. The stress, the pressure, the endless financial treadmill. And for the first time, Someone was explaining why it felt impossible to escape. The driver eventually reached a point where dividends alone generated more money each year than most Australians earned working full-time. Think about that for a second. While millions woke up every morning trapped in traffic heading to jobs they hated, this man's shares quietly deposited income into his account while he slept. That's not fantasy. That's the power of ownership. And Scott became obsessed with teaching Australians that difference. Employees trade time for money. Investors buy assets that generate money independently. The driver understood this before almost anyone around him. And that understanding transformed his entire future. Years later, when Scott finally shared the story publicly, reactions exploded online. Some people felt inspired. Others felt angry. Because stories like this force people to confront painful realities. How much money had they wasted trying to impress strangers? How many years had disappeared financing lifestyles they couldn't actually afford? How many opportunities had they ignored because investing looked too boring? The driver's story exposed all of it brutally. And maybe that's why it spread so powerfully. Because underneath the numbers, it wasn't really a story about money. It was a story about freedom. About escaping invisible pressure. About refusing to let modern consumer culture dictate your future. Scott understood that deeply. That's why his financial advice always sounded different from typical investment gurus. He didn't worship luxury. He worshipped independence. And the driver embodied that perfectly. There's one final moment from the story that still gives people chills. Near the end of their conversation, Scott asked the driver a simple question. If you could tell young Australians one thing, what would it be? The driver stared out the window quietly. Cars passed outside under cold Melbourne rain. Then he finally answered. Stop buying things to impress people who don't care about you. Silence. No dramatic speech. No flashy quote. Just brutal truth. And honestly, that sentence explains almost everything wrong with modern financial culture. People are exhausted financially because they're constantly performing success instead of building it. Scott knew that. The driver knew that. But most people still refuse to see it. Because the pressure is everywhere. Social media. Advertising. Comparison. Endless upgrades. The world constantly whispers the same message. You are not enough yet. Not successful enough. Not rich enough. Not impressive enough. So people spend. And spend. And spend. Meanwhile, years disappear. But the driver escaped that trap. He built wealth quietly while the world chased appearances loudly. And maybe that's why Scott Pape never forgot his story. Because it proved something powerful. Ordinary people can still build extraordinary wealth. Not through luck. Not through hype. But through patience most people no longer possess. Today, millions of Australians still sit trapped in financial stress despite earning decent money. Still chasing lifestyles they can barely sustain. Still mistaking consumption for success. And somewhere out there, another quiet investor is probably doing exactly what that driver once did. Buying shares silently. Reinvesting dividends. Ignoring noise. Building freedom one decision at a time. Nobody notices them yet. Nobody thinks they're wealthy. But one day, people will look at the results and call it luck. Even though it was discipline all along. And maybe that's the most important lesson Scott Pape ever tried to teach Australia. Real wealth is built quietly while the world gets distracted by noise. Because in the end, the bloke driving an old truck through freezing Australian mornings wasn't really chasing millions. He was chasing something far more valuable. A life without fear. A future without financial chains. The freedom to wake up and choose. And after everything Scott learned from him, maybe that's what true wealth was always supposed to mean.